curling from rooftops, the bitter cold curling from rooftops, the bitter cold keeping even the bravest souls inside. A black Maybach cut through the quiet, its tires crunching softly against the fresh snow. It pulled to a stop near a deserted bus station in the Lower East Side. Ronan Whitaker stepped out first, tall and dangerous. His black cashmere coat hung over a tailored charcoal suit, and his steel-gray eyes scanned the street with the precision of a man who trusted no one. He extended his hand, and a little girl with chestnut curls bounced down into the snow, her pink tutu peeking beneath her winter coat. "Careful, princess," he said, adjusting her scarf. "Let's get you home." "Daddy, can we get hot chocolate first?" Alara beamed, clutching his hand. For a moment, Ronan almost smiled. Almost. But the warmth never quite reached his eyes. It had been years since Vivian was taken from him, gunned down in a war he should have ended sooner. He blamed himself every day. And though he wore the mask of the city's most feared man, inside, he was hollow. They walked toward the car when Alara suddenly stopped. "Daddy," she whispered, "why is that lady sleeping outside?" Ronan turned. On a rusted bench, beneath a flickering bus sign, a young woman lay curled against the cold, blonde hair tangled with frost, a thin sweater offering nothing against the brutal wind, and in her trembling arms, a baby wrapped in a worn blanket barely moving. Ronan's jaw tightened. He reached for Alara's hand. "Keep walking. She's not our problem." But Alara pulled back. "Daddy, the baby is shaking. He's so tiny." Her voice cracked. "He's going to freeze." Ronan looked down at his daughter. Her brown eyes, Vivian's eyes, stared up at him, full of something he had tried to bury. Compassion. A memory struck him like a bullet. Vivian, pale in the hospital bed, her fingers weak in his. "Don't let the darkness swallow you, Ronan. Teach Alara to love. Promise me." He had promised. Without a word, Ronan unwrapped the cashmere scarf from his own neck. Alara watched in silence as her father, the most dangerous man in New York, walked toward the sleeping stranger. What happens when the devil shows mercy? If this story touched your heart, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Subscribe now because the best part is only just beginning. Ronan knelt beside the bench, his breath forming pale white wisps in the freezing air. He draped the cashmere scarf over the baby, then gently touched the woman's shoulder. Her skin was ice cold through the thin fabric. "You can't stay here," he said, his voice low and final. "The baby will freeze to death." The woman jolted awake, her blue eyes flying open in panic. And in an instant she yanked the baby out of Ronan's reach, pressing back against the bench like a cornered animal. "Don't touch my child." Her voice was rough, cracking out of a throat gone dry. Her wild eyes swept over Ronan, over the expensive suit, over the Maybach parked not far away, and suspicion showed in every line of her pale face. Ronan didn't step back. He was used to people being afraid of him, but this woman's gaze held more than fear. It held hatred, exhaustion, and something deeper that he recognized at once because he'd carried the same thing inside himself for years. Pain. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "But if you stay here another hour, the baby won't make it through tonight." The woman clutched the baby tighter, as if her gaunt body could become a shield. "I don't need your pity," she snarled. "Men like you are good at making promises and then betraying them. I've heard enough fake kindness." Ronan frowned. There was a story behind that bitterness. He knew it. But now wasn't the time to ask, because at that moment the baby in her arms began to cough. Not the ordinary cough of an infant. It was violent, tearing through the winter night silence, threaded with a frightening wheeze. The child's tiny face turned a sickly purple. Its little fingers curled in tight spasms, and its whole body shook in waves. "No, no, no!" the woman cried in terror, patting the baby's back, trying to soothe the fit. But the baby didn't stop. The coughing grew heavier, the breathing more strained. tears started rolling down her cheeks, mixing with the snow falling onto her skin. Ronan rose, and this time his voice was as cold as ice, leaving no room for bargaining. "You can hate me. You can distrust me. But the baby needs a doctor right now, not tomorrow, not in an hour. Right now." He pointed toward the Maybach. "My car has heat. I've got a private doctor who can be here within minutes. You can keep sitting here and watch your child die, or you can swallow your pride and let me help." Cruel words, cold words, but they were the truth, and Ronan didn't have time to speak softly. The woman looked down at the baby in her arms. Her son was gasping, lips gone purple, his small body trembling without end. For months, she'd done everything to keep him alive. She'd gone hungry so he could have milk. She'd stayed awake through the night to keep him warm. She'd endured the cold, the humiliation, the loneliness, all for him. And now, watching her son struggle for breath in her arms, she knew pride wouldn't save him. She looked up at Ronan, and he saw the moment she surrendered, not to him, but to reality. "All right," she whispered, her voice breaking apart. "All right." She tried to stand, but her numb, frozen legs wouldn't obey. She staggered, nearly falling, and Ronan was there, one hand steadying her elbow, the other lightly braced at her back. She didn't resist anymore. She didn't have the strength to resist. They moved toward the car, her steps leaving smeared, uneven marks across the white snow. The door opened, warmth spilling out like an embrace, and the woman nearly collapsed into the back seat. Alara was already sitting there, big eyes fixed on the strange woman and the baby in her arms, with the bright curiosity of a child. "Ma'am," Alara asked, her voice clear, "what's the baby's name?" The woman looked at the little girl, then looked down at her son, who was slowly settling as the car's heat wrapped around him. A tear slid down her cheek. "Liam," she whispered. "My son's name is Liam." The Maybach glided through the empty streets of Manhattan and came to a stop in front of a high-rise building in Tribeca. Sloane lifted her gaze through the car window, and she had to blink a few times to be sure she wasn't dreaming. The building towered before her like a fortress of wealth, its glass face reflecting the city lights, and even in the dead of night, she could see luxury radiating from every line of its design. The door opened, and a large man in a black suit bowed to Ronan. "Boss," he said, respectful. Sloane stepped out with Liam in her arms, her legs still trembling, and she noticed the man who'd opened the door had a gun tucked at his waist. She swallowed hard but said nothing, only followed Ronan inside. The lobby stole Sloane's breath. White marble ran from floor to wall. Crystal chandeliers hung high overhead, and a glossy walnut reception desk sat at the center. Two other men in black suits stood guard at the elevator doors, and they bowed as Ronan passed. A private elevator carried them to the highest floor, and when the doors slid open, Sloane stepped into a world she'd never imagined. The penthouse spread out like a palace in the sky with soaring ceilings, works of art on the walls, and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Manhattan, glittering in the night. But in the middle of all that splendor, Sloane noticed what didn't fit. Security cameras in every corner, steel doors hidden behind decorative wood panels, and more than that, men in black suits scattered throughout the space, their eyes tracking every movement. This wasn't the home of an ordinary businessman. This was a fortress. "The doctor will be here any minute," Ronan said, and as if his words had magic in them, less than minutes later, a middle-aged man carrying a leather case walked in. He examined Liam carefully while Sloane sat close. Her hands clenched so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Pneumonia," the doctor finally said, looking up at Ronan. "Lucky it isn't too advanced. If it had been a few more hours—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Sloane understood. A few more hours, and her son might not have been here anymore. "He needs monitoring for at least a week," the doctor continued, writing out prescriptions. "Keep him warm, feed him regularly, and absolutely do not let him get chilled again." Sloane nodded, tears rising fast. A week. She would have to stay here a week with this stranger in this strange penthouse with armed guards and security cameras everywhere, but she had no other choice. The click of heels echoed over the stone floor, and Sloane looked up to see an older woman approaching. Her silver hair was pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, her back straight as a ruler, and her eyes sharp as blades. She swept her gaze over Sloane from head to toe, from the tangled blonde hair still dusted with snow, to the thin, filthy sweater, to the cloth shoes with worn-through soles. And she didn't bother to hide the suspicion carved into her face. "Mr. Whitaker," she said, her tone as cold as stone, "I'll prepare the guest room." Not a single greeting for Sloane, not a single friendly glance, only silent judgment and a clear distance. Sloane felt like a stain in the middle of this spotless penthouse. "Thank you, Mrs. Harlan," Ronan replied. The housekeeper nodded and turned away. But before she could leave the room, a tiny hand reached up and took hold of Sloane's. "Ma'am." Alara looked up, brown eyes sparkling. "Come on, I'll show you my mommy's room. It's so pretty." Before Sloane could react, the little girl was already tugging her down the hallway. Sloane held Liam close and hurried after her, and she could feel Ronan's gaze following them until they disappeared around the corner. Alara stopped in front of a closed door. "Daddy doesn't let anyone in here," she whispered like she was sharing a secret. "But I sneak in all the time. I miss Mommy." She pushed the door open, and Sloane stepped into a room overflowing with the memory of someone gone. Everything was still in place. Perfume bottles on the vanity, an ivory silk scarf draped over a chair, a pair of high heels set neatly beside the bed, as if the woman who owned the room had only stepped out and could return at any moment. And on the wall, a wedding photograph. The woman in the picture had glossy brown hair, a smile warm as spring sunlight, and gentle eyes looking into the camera with nothing but love and happiness. Beside her stood Ronan, but it was a completely different Ronan. He was smiling, a bright smile that reached all the way into his eyes with none of the cold distance Sloane had seen tonight. "My mommy's name was Vivian," Alara said softly. "She had light hair like you." Sloane looked at the photograph, then at the room kept like a shrine, and suddenly she understood. The emptiness in Ronan's gray eyes, the coldness like armor he wore over his soul, the luxurious penthouse that held no warmth. The most powerful man in this city was living with a wound that would never heal. Sloane woke in an unfamiliar room, needing a few seconds to remember where she was. Morning light slipped through the curtains, and Liam was sleeping peacefully in a white crib someone had brought in sometime after midnight. She sat up, looked around the guest room furnished like a five-star hotel suite, and the decision in her heart became clear. She'd stay until Liam was well, and then she'd leave. She didn't know where she'd go, but she couldn't remain in this place any longer than she had to. There was something about this penthouse, about the man named Ronan Whitaker, that made unease sink all the way into her bones. Liam cried to be fed, and after she nursed him, Sloane carried him out into the main living area to find water. The penthouse was quiet in the daylight, but she could still see the men in black suits stationed in the corners. They didn't look at her, yet she knew they were tracking every step she took. She moved down the hallway toward the kitchen she'd glimpsed the night before, but voices from the study made her stop. The door was slightly ajar, and Ronan's voice carried out, cold and heavy with authority. "The shipment at the port has been handled," another voice answered, low and solid. "Russo is eyeing the East Side territory. He thinks you've gone soft after what happened last month." "Russo," Ronan repeated the name with contempt. "Let him know that if he crosses the line, I'll send every one of his fingers back to his wife." Sloane went still. Her arms tightened around Liam until the baby shifted in discomfort. Shipment. Territory. Send every one of his fingers. The words tore through her mind like a storm, and the picture of the man who'd saved her the night before began to warp into something else entirely. She took a step back, but her elbow clipped a small table in the hallway. A glass of water toppled to the floor and shattered, the sharp sound cutting through the morning silence. Everything froze. Then the study door flew open. Ronan stepped out, followed by a middle-aged man Sloane had never seen before. The man had salt and pepper hair, a face carved with hard lines, yet he carried the steady reliability of someone who'd survived a lot of rough water. But his eyes were different. Sharp as a blade, they swept over Sloane with the wary assessment of a predator sizing up a threat. "Who's this?" he asked Ronan, his tone making no effort to hide suspicion. "My guest," Ronan replied, calm as if nothing had happened. "You can go, Dante." The man named Dante said nothing more, but before he left, he threw Sloane a look that carried meaning. That look said he'd investigate her, learn who she was, and if she was a threat, he'd deal with her. The elevator doors closed behind Dante, and Sloane faced Ronan in a heavy silence. Her heart pounded in her chest, and every instinct in her screamed at her to run, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking, fighting to stay steady. "Who are you, really?" Ronan looked at her, his gray eyes unmoved. He stepped closer, and Sloane backed up until her spine hit the wall. He stopped a few paces away, not pressing in further, but his presence still filled the space like weight. "I'm Ronan Whitaker," he said, his voice low and clear. "Does that name mean anything to you?" Whitaker. Sloane felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. She'd heard that name. Who in New York hadn't heard of Whitaker? The whispered stories in cheap bars, the articles about crimes that were never solved, the rumors of an underworld empire controlling half the city. You're... She couldn't finish the sentence, as if speaking it aloud would make it a truth she could never deny. Ronan didn't help her complete it. He only stood there and waited like a judge, waiting for the accused to confess. "I run things you shouldn't know about," he said at last. "I do things you shouldn't see. My world isn't meant for people like you." He paused and his voice softened a little, only a little. "But in this house, you're safe. That's all you need to understand." "I want to leave," Sloane said it at once without thinking. "I want to get out of here right now." "The doors aren't locked," Ronan answered, pointing toward the elevator. "You can go any time you want." He tipped his chin toward Liam in her arms. "But your son needs at least another week to fully recover. The doctor made that clear. If you take him back out into the cold now, the pneumonia will worsen." He looked straight into her eyes. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Silence. The question hung in the air like a sentence. Sloane opened her mouth, wanting to say yes, wanting to lie that she had a place, family, anything at all. But no words came because the truth was, she had nothing. No home, no money, no family, no future. Only empty hands and a child who needed her to survive. Ronan read the answer in her silence. "Stay," he said, not quite an order, but not really an offer either. "For the baby. For..." He hesitated and something flickered in his gray eyes. "For Alara. She needs a woman." Then he turned away and walked back toward the study, leaving Sloane alone in the hallway with her child in her arms and a decision she couldn't make. She was standing in the den of the most dangerous wolf in New York, and she had no choice but to stay. A week passed in the penthouse like a strange dream Sloane didn't know whether to call a nightmare or a miracle. Liam grew stronger day by day. The cough disappeared, and his little cheeks began to turn rosy again. The doctor came to check on him every day. The medicine was always there, and there was never a shortage of formula or diapers. Sloane knew she should be grateful, and she truly was. But every night, lying on the soft bed in that luxurious guest room, she couldn't sleep. Tonight was no different. She stared at the ceiling for hours, then finally got up, checked on Liam sleeping soundly in his crib, and quietly stepped out onto the balcony. The night air cut like a blade, but Sloane was used to cold. Months on the streets had taught her to endure things far worse. She leaned against the railing, looking down at Manhattan, glittering below like a carpet of light stretched into infinity. And she wondered how many people out there were also awake, just like her. You can't sleep either. The low voice came from behind her, and Sloane startled, turning around. Ronan stood in a corner of the balcony she hadn't seen, a glass of whiskey in his hand, his eyes distant in the dark. He didn't turn to look at her, as if he'd known she was there for a long time. "I'm used to it," Sloane replied, her voice as light as breath. "For months, I haven't slept more than 2 hours a night." Ronan turned, and for the first time since she'd met him, Sloane saw something different in those gray eyes. Not the usual coldness, not the menace of a man with power, but curiosity, and maybe, just maybe, a trace of understanding. "Why?" he asked, his voice lower than usual. "How did you end up like this? A young woman, educated, clearly not the kind of person who lives on the street. What happened?" Silence stretched between them. The night wind blew through, sharp and bitter. But Sloane didn't shiver. She'd shivered enough, cried enough, been afraid enough. Now, standing on the balcony of this extravagant penthouse, facing the most dangerous man in the city, she felt a strange kind of calm. Maybe because he was the only person who'd asked her that question and actually wanted to hear the answer. "Ryan Mitchell," she began, and the name left her lips like a wound bleeding fresh. Senator Mitchell's son, handsome, charming, promising the whole world. She let out a bitter laugh. "I did interior design work for his family's company. We fell in love, or at least I thought we did. He said he'd marry me. He said we'd have a future together." Sloane paused and drew in a deep breath. "Then I got pregnant, and he disappeared." She went on, her voice even like she was reading someone else's story. "Ryan's family came in his place, $50,000 to make me get an abortion and vanish from their son's life. When I refused, they destroyed me, fired me for theft I never committed, ruined my reputation so thoroughly no company would dare hire me. My parents had died in a car accident years earlier. No siblings, no relatives, no one to turn to. I gave birth to Liam in a charity hospital, alone, with no hand to hold, no voice to comfort me. Then I walked out onto the streets with a newborn in my arms and not a penny to my name." "Months," Sloane said, and her voice broke for the first time. "I kept my son alive for months with empty hands. I ate food people threw away so I could have milk to feed him. I slept under bridges, in parks, on bus benches. I did everything so Liam could live." Tears ran down her cheeks, but she didn't wipe them away. "And the night you found me, that night, I thought it was the last one. I didn't have anything left. I thought at least if we died, we'd die together." Ronan didn't speak while she told it. He only stood there, still as stone. But Sloane saw his hand tighten around the whiskey glass until blue veins rose under his skin. When she finished, the silence stretched until it was hard to breathe. "Ryan Mitchell," he said at last, and the way he repeated the name made Sloane's skin prickle. Not anger, not a threat, but the voice of a man carving a name into memory, like carving it into a gravestone. "Don't do anything," Sloane blurted, panic flaring as she understood what was hiding inside that tone. "I don't want trouble. I don't want revenge. I just want peace. I just want to raise my son." Ronan looked at her, and for the first time, that cold gray gaze softened. Not fully warm, but no longer steel. "You've endured too much," he said, his voice so low and gentle. Sloane almost thought she'd imagined it. Alone for too long. He didn't say anything else. No promises, no consolation, no empty phrases she'd heard too many times. He only stood there beside her, two strangers staring out at a sleeping city, each carrying their own wounds. They stood that way until the first streaks of dawn painted the Manhattan horizon pink. And through all that time, neither of them spoke another word. But Sloane felt it. For the first time in months of hell, she wasn't completely alone anymore. Days after that night on the balcony, Sloane's life inside the penthouse began to shift in ways she never saw coming. She no longer felt like an intruder, even though she kept reminding herself this wasn't her home, that she was only a guest, that she'd have to leave soon. But those boundaries grew thinner every day, especially when Alara began knocking on her door each morning with a radiant smile and the same familiar question, "Sloane, will you read me a story today?" And Sloane couldn't say no. She started spending most of her time with the child, reading fairy tales from Alara's little library, playing dolls on the soft fur rug, teaching her to draw flowers and butterflies with colored pencils. Alara learned quickly, and every time she finished a picture, she'd run through the penthouse to show everyone as if it were a masterpiece. "Sloane, I like you better than Mrs. Harlan," Alara announced one afternoon. So serious, Sloane had to fight back a laugh. "Mrs. Harlan makes me eat vegetables. You don't make me eat vegetables." "Vegetables are good for you," Sloane said gently, "but vegetables taste bad." Alara pouted. "My mommy used to say that too. My mommy didn't like vegetables either." Sloane's heart tightened every time Alara mentioned Vivian. The little girl spoke of her mother naturally, without tragedy, as if Vivian had only gone away and would come back. That innocence was both sweet and devastating. Liam recovered completely, and the quiet penthouse suddenly filled with children's laughter. Her son began to laugh out loud, bright bell-like sounds spilling out whenever Alara pulled a silly face or Sloane blew raspberries on his belly. That sound felt like magic, melting the cold that had settled over this house for years. Even Mrs. Harlan changed. Sloane noticed the housekeeper sometimes standing in a corner of the room watching her play with Alara, and the suspicion she'd had at the beginning slowly gave way to something else. One afternoon, while Sloane was nursing Liam in the living room, Mrs. Harlan came over and set a cup of hot tea on the table beside her. "You take good care of Alara," she said, her voice still stern, but no longer cold. "It's been a long time since she's laughed this much." Sloane looked up, so surprised she didn't know what to say. It was the first time Mrs. Harlan had spoken to her like a person instead of an intruder who needed watching. "Thank you," Sloane finally managed, and the housekeeper nodded and walked away. But Sloane could have sworn she saw the faintest hint of a smile on those severe lips. But the biggest change came from Ronan. He started coming home earlier each day, sometimes even before Alara got out of ballet class. Mrs. Harlan told Sloane this had never happened in the past years, not since Vivian died. Before, he always worked late, ate dinner alone in his study, and only saw Alara for a few minutes before she went to sleep. Now he sat down to dinner with them. One evening, all four of them gathered around the dining table like a real family. Ronan sat at the head of the table, Alara on his right, Sloane on his left, and Liam in his high chair between Sloane and Alara. Alara chattered about ballet class, about her teacher, about her classmates, about the new step she was practicing. Liam clapped and laughed whenever Alara acted it out, and Sloane smiled at the two children, forgetting for a moment that she was sitting at the same table as the most powerful Mafia boss in New York. Then she looked up and caught Ronan watching the scene with an expression she'd never seen on him before. Not cold, not distant, but stunned, as if he couldn't believe what he was seeing, as if he was afraid that if he blinked, everything would vanish. After dinner, Sloane and Ronan put Alara to bed together. The little girl lay between them in her princess bed, listening to Sloane read while Ronan sat nearby, quietly watching his daughter. When Alara drifted off to sleep, they both stood. Both pulled the blanket up around her, and their hands brushed by accident. They both startled. Sloane looked up, and Ronan's gray eyes were fixed on her. In the dim glow of the nightlight, she saw something in that gaze, something she didn't dare name. No one spoke. No one pulled their hand away. They stood like that for one heartbeat, then another, and then Ronan was the first to move. He drew his hand back, turned away, and walked out of the room without a word. But Sloane could still feel the warmth of his touch lingering on her skin, and her heart was racing for a reason she didn't want to admit. The next 2 weeks slipped by, and dinners together stopped feeling unusual and became routine. Every evening when Ronan stepped out of the elevator, Alara would run to wrap her arms around his legs, Liam would clap and laugh from his high chair, and Sloane would stand at the dining table, setting out an extra place for him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No one said it out loud, but they had become a family in the strangest possible way. and sleepless nights became a habit that belonged to Sloane and Ronan alone. They often met on the balcony at around 2 in the morning when the city had already fallen asleep, and only distant lights blinked far away. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they simply stood beside each other in silence, but that silence no longer felt heavy. It became comfortable, as if they'd grown so used to each other's presence that words weren't needed to fill the space. Tonight, Ronan was drinking more than usual. Sloane realized it the moment she stepped onto the balcony and saw the whiskey bottle was nearly half gone. He leaned against the railing, eyes fixed on the night, but Sloane knew he wasn't really seeing anything. He was looking into the past. "Is today some kind of special day?" she asked gently, stopping a few steps away. Ronan didn't answer right away. He lifted the whiskey to his lips, took a long drink, and only then spoke. "This day years ago, Vivian—" He stopped as if the name was too heavy to carry in his mouth. "This day years ago, I lost her." Sloane stayed quiet. She didn't know what to say, and maybe Ronan didn't need her to say anything. He needed to be heard. Vivian. "She wasn't like anyone I'd ever met," Ronan began, his voice low and far away, like he was speaking to himself. "I met her in an alley in Brooklyn. Some punks were beating a homeless kid and she ran in to stop it. A tiny girl. No weapon, no backup. Standing up to 3 men twice her size." He gave a soft laugh. The first Sloane had seen from him that carried real warmth. "I stood there staring at her like an idiot. Then I stepped in, handled the punks, and she scolded me for using violence." He shook his head. "She didn't know who I was, didn't know I could order all 3 of those men killed, and no one would dare ask why. And when she found out, when she discovered I was Ronan Whitaker, the man the whole city feared—" He paused, eyes fixed on empty air. "She didn't run. She said she loved the man I was, not the name I carried. She loved me before she knew I was a monster, and after she knew, she stayed." Ronan's voice dropped. "We got married. We had a Lara. 4 years. 4 years. The happiest 4 years in my blood-soaked life. I thought I could have it all. Power, money, and a family that loved me." He took another drink, his hand tightening around the glass until Sloane was afraid it might crack. Then Russo made his move. "An assassination attempt meant for me on an ordinary night when we were out celebrating our wedding anniversary. A sniper on the rooftop across the street. I saw the glint of light on the scope and I turned back just in time." His voice broke for the first time. "Vivian shoved me out of the way. She took the bullet for me. The bullet meant for my heart went through her chest." Sloane felt tears rise, not for herself, but for the man standing in front of her with a wound still bleeding after years. "She died in my arms," Ronan went on, his voice now barely more than a whisper. "Right there in the street. Her blood soaked into my suit, and the last thing she said was to take care of Ilara. For me. For the damned world I built." He turned to look at Sloane, and she saw those gray eyes shining with tears. "From that day on, I froze. I didn't allow myself to love anyone. I didn't allow myself to feel anything. I thought if I had nothing to lose, no one could hurt me again." He paused and added, his voice so soft Sloane had to lean in to hear it. "Until you showed up. The night wind swept through and snow began to fall. White flakes drifted through the air, landing in Sloane's hair on her shoulders, and she shivered from the cold. Without a word, Ronan took off his coat and settled it over her shoulders. The motion so natural it felt as if he'd done it 1,000 times before, like that first night with the cashmere scarf on the bus bench. "That night," Sloane whispered, pulling the coat tighter around herself. "The night you found me on the bench, I thought it was the last night for me and Liam. I was ready to let go." "I'm so glad," Ronan said, his voice low and warm, "that it wasn't the last night." They looked at each other through the falling snow, and Sloane felt her heart stumble over itself for something she didn't dare name. The next morning, they all sat down for breakfast together like they did every day. Ilara was attacking her plate of pancakes with the fierce enthusiasm of a child. Liam was playing with the small pieces of banana, and Ronan was reading the newspaper while he drank his coffee, ordinary, warm, like a real family. Then Ilara looked up, syrup on her mouth, and asked in the most innocent voice, "Daddy, why don't you marry Sloane so she can be my mom?" The whole room froze. Sloane nearly choked on her orange juice. Ronan lowered the newspaper, his face blank but his ears turning faintly red. Mrs. Harlan was coming closer with a tea tray, and she almost dropped it to the floor. "Ilara," Ronan said, his voice calm to the point of sounding fake. "Grown-up things are complicated. You wouldn't understand." Ilara tilted her head, brown eyes just like her mother's, looking at him in confusion. "But you like Sloane. I see you look at Sloane the same way you look at Mommy Vivian in the wedding picture." She paused, then added with the certainty only a child could have, "Mommy Vivian in heaven would be happy if you weren't sad anymore, I know it." No one spoke. Sloane didn't dare look at Ronan, and Ronan didn't dare look at Sloane, but they both knew that a child had just said aloud what they were both trying to bury. A few miles away on the other side of the city, in a penthouse apartment in Brooklyn overlooking the Manhattan Bridge, a man sat in the dark. Victor Russo drew on a Cuban cigar, and the smoke curled around his sharp-featured face like gray snakes. In front of him, spread across a black oak table, lay dozens of covert photographs. A blonde woman was holding the hand of a little girl in a pink tutu as they walked through a park. The woman was smiling and the child was skipping beside her. In another photo, the woman held a newborn on a balcony of a high-rise building. Russo knew very well, the penthouse of Ronan Whitaker. "Whitaker has a new toy," Russo murmured, the corner of his mouth lifting into a cold smile. "Interesting. Very interesting." He picked up one photograph and studied Sloane's face beneath the lamp. Beautiful, young, and clearly important to Whitaker. If the man allowed her to live in his home and play with his daughter, years earlier, Russo had ordered the assassination of Ronan Whitaker. That bullet should have ended the war that had dragged on for decades between the two families. Instead, Whitaker's wife died, and the war became more brutal than ever. Whitaker took revenge by killing Russo's younger brother, cutting off his head and sending it back in a gift box. Since then, they had been locked in a standoff, neither daring a direct strike, both waiting for an opening. And now, it seemed the opening had arrived. A knock sounded at the door, and a man stepped inside. Ryan Mitchell did not look like someone walking into the lair of a devil. An expensive three-piece suit, hair neatly combed, polished leather shoes. But his eyes were different. They darted around the room with fear he could not hide, and when he saw Russo seated in the darkness, he swallowed pitifully. "You called for me?" Ryan asked, trying to keep his voice steady and failing miserably. Russo did not answer at once. He simply sat there, drawing on the cigar, letting the silence stretch long enough that Ryan began to sweat. Then he tossed a photograph onto the table right in front of Ryan. "Your whore," Russo said, his tone as mild as if discussing the weather, "is living with my enemy. An interesting coincidence, isn't it?" Ryan looked down at the photograph and his face went pale. Sloane. She stood beside Whitaker, and Whitaker was looking at her with an expression Ryan had never seen on the coldest Mafia boss in New York. I didn't know," Ryan stammered. "Of course you didn't," Russo cut in. "You abandoned her when she got pregnant. Your family tried to force her to end the pregnancy. When she refused, you destroyed her life." He tilted his head, his eyes bright with cruel delight. "And now she is living in Ronan Whitaker's penthouse, playing with his daughter, maybe even sleeping in his bed, while you," he gave a mocking laugh, "you are about to run for senator." Ryan felt the blood in his veins turn to ice. "How do you know?" Russo said. "I know everything." He stood and walked to the window. "I know how much money you have spent to silence witnesses. I know how many people your family's lawyer threatened so they would not dare speak. And I know that if this illegitimate child scandal is exposed," he turned back, looking at Ryan with the gaze of a snake, "your political career will be dead before it even begins." Ryan stood frozen, unable to speak. Everything he had built, every ambition, every dream of power and status, all of it trembled on the edge of collapse. And the man in front of him held the rope that could drag him into the abyss. "But I can help you," Russo said, his voice sweet as honey laced with poison. "Take care of her and the baby. Clean, no traces. No one will ever know you had a child with an unknown interior designer." Ryan hesitated. One part of him, the last scrap of conscience, screamed in protest. That was his child. That was the woman who had once loved him with her whole heart. But another part, far larger, the part raised on ambition and selfishness all his life, began to calculate. "What do you want in return?" he asked at last, and that question stamped his fate. Russo smiled. The smile of a man who had just won a game his opponent did not even realize he was playing. "Whitaker," he said. "She is his weakness. For the first time in years, he has let someone into his life. We will use her to draw him out of his den. And when he is out, when his guard is down because he wants to protect this woman," he sliced the air with a final decisive gesture, "I will take his life." Ryan nodded, not daring to meet Russo's eyes. They shook hands, and in that moment, two men, utterly different in every way, became allies. The man who had killed Ronan's wife and the man who had betrayed Sloane, now plotting together to destroy the fragile happiness taking root in a penthouse in Tribeca. When Ryan left, Russo turned back to the window and stared out at the city sunken in night. "Whitaker took my brother's life," he whispered to the darkness. "I will take his new woman, and this time he will not be there in time to take the bullet." Days after the night Ronan called to threaten Ryan Mitchell, the atmosphere in the penthouse turned strange. The tension was still there, hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't made landfall yet. But inside that tension were stretches of silence that felt heavy with meaning. Ronan was no longer the man who stood beside her on the balcony each night, no longer the man who looked at her with that rare softness in the quiet moments. He became distant, cold, and so tense that even Alara noticed. "What's wrong with Daddy, Sloane?" the little girl asked one afternoon when Ronan walked through the living room without stopping to play with her the way he always did. "Daddy doesn't hug me anymore." Sloane didn't know how to answer because she was asking herself the same question. Ronan no longer ate dinner with them. He locked himself in his study from morning until late at night, meeting constantly with Dante and the men in black suits Sloane didn't know by name. The number of bodyguards in the penthouse doubled, and every time Sloane took Alara outside, there were always at least 4 men following instead of the 2 from before. Something was happening, and Ronan was keeping it from her. One evening, after Alara was asleep and Liam was resting quietly in his crib, Sloane decided to confront him. She found Ronan in the living room, standing at the window with a glass of whiskey in his hand, his shoulders pulled tight, like a drawn wire. "What's going on?" she asked bluntly without circling around it. "You've been strange for days." Ronan didn't turn. "Nothing. Work's busy." "Don't lie to me." Sloane stepped closer. "I may not know much about your world, but I know when someone is hiding something. And you're hiding something." Ronan finally turned, and Sloane saw the dark circles under his eyes, saw the exhaustion he was trying to hide, but he still didn't explain. He only shook his head and walked past her toward the study. "Ronan!" she called, but he was already gone behind the door. That night, Sloane lay in bed and couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, thinking about Ronan's sudden change, the increased security, the worry Mrs. Harlan tried to hide whenever she looked at Sloane. Something was terribly wrong, and Sloane needed to know what it was. Around 2 a.m, Sloane woke to check on Liam and saw light still spilling through the crack beneath Ronan's study door. She hesitated, then made herself walk over. The door wasn't locked, and when Sloane pushed gently, it opened without a sound. Ronan was sitting at his desk, eyes fixed on his laptop screen, not realizing she'd come in. Sloane moved closer and her heart seemed to stop when she saw what was on the screen. Pictures of her, dozens of covert photos. Her holding Alara's hand in the park, her carrying Liam at a coffee shop, her standing at the penthouse window, her laughing with Alara on the street. Each photograph had been taken from a distance by someone who was watching, observing, waiting. Who took these pictures? Sloane's voice trembled as it came out, and Ronan jerked around. He snapped the laptop shut immediately, but it was too late. Sloane had already seen everything. Sloane, he rose, but she stepped back. Who's watching me? Why? Is it because of you? Ronan went silent for a moment, then let out a slow breath, as if he knew he couldn't hide it anymore. People who want to hurt me, he said, his voice low and heavy. They've been watching this penthouse for a long time. But he stopped, looking at her with an expression Sloane couldn't read. But now they know you matter to me. Matter? Sloane echoed, her heart stumbling. You're my weakness, Sloane, Ronan cut in, his voice edged with pain. You and Liam. For the first time in years, I let someone into my life and they noticed. They'll use you to get to me the same way they used Vivian. The name hit like a splash of ice water. Sloane understood instantly. Then I should leave, she said, fighting to keep her voice steady even as her heart began to break. If being here puts you in danger, if it puts Alara in danger, I'll go. I'll take Liam. No. Ronan stepped forward and caught her hand, and Sloane felt the strength in his grip along with the desperation he was trying to hold back. You leaving is what's dangerous here. In this house, I can protect you. I've got guards, security systems, everything to keep you safe. But if you go out there alone with Liam, with no one protecting you. He didn't finish the sentence, but Sloane understood. Out there, she would be easy prey. Stay, Ronan said, his voice almost pleading, something Sloane never thought she'd hear from him. Stay and let me protect you, please. Sloane looked into those gray eyes, and she saw real fear. Not fear for himself, fear for her. And in that moment, she realized she had fallen into a world more dangerous than anything she'd ever imagined. Days after the conversation in the study, Ronan decided Sloane and Alara needed to go out. Not because he wanted to, but because Alara had started asking why she couldn't go to the park anymore, why she couldn't go to the movies, why she had to stay inside all day like she was being kept in a cage. He didn't want his daughter to grow up in fear, even though he himself was drowning in that fear every day. Mrs. Harlan volunteered to take Sloane and Alara shopping, and Ronan agreed on the condition that Jack Sullivan would go with them, along with 2 other guards following in a separate car. It was the first time Sloane had stepped outside the penthouse in weeks, and she had to admit the feeling of sunlight touching her skin. The feeling of New York winter air filling her lungs was genuinely wonderful. The mall was crowded with shoppers, and Alara looked like she'd been released into heaven. She tugged Sloane's hand and ran from one store to the next, eyes blazing with excitement when she saw princess dresses behind glass. Sloane, look, Elsa's dress. I want Elsa's dress. Alara squealed, pointing at a sparkling blue gown that looked like ice and snow. Sloane smiled and bent down to the child's level. Then, let's go try it on. Alara nodded eagerly and they stepped into the shop, Mrs. Harlan following with a rare smile on her lips, while Jack Sullivan stood guard at the entrance, his eyes sweeping the crowd without ever stopping. Sloane was helping Alara into the 3rd dress when she heard that voice, the voice she had tried to forget for almost a year, the voice that had once whispered love, then vanished without explanation. Sloane. She froze. Everything around her seemed to stop moving. Then she turned slowly, and standing in front of her was Ryan Mitchell. He didn't look any different from the last time she'd seen him, maybe even more polished. An expensive gray suit, hair neatly styled, that charming smile she'd once been drunk on. But now that smile only made her want to be sick. Baby. Ryan stepped closer, his face full of regret, his eyes full of suffering performed with perfect skill. I've been looking for you for so long. I'm sorry. I was wrong. I made a terrible mistake." Sloane stepped back on instinct, pulling Alara behind her. The little girl stared at the strange man with curiosity and a flicker of fear, sensing the tension pouring off the woman she loved. "Get away," Sloane said, her voice like ice. "Baby, please listen. Let me explain." Ryan moved closer, both hands raised as if trying to calm a wild animal. "I know I hurt you. I know my family treated you badly, but I want to fix it. I want to meet my son. I have the right." "Right?" Sloane cut him off, a bitter laugh ripping out of her throat. "You're talking to me about rights. You abandoned us when I needed you most. You vanished like a coward when she needed you most. Your family tried to force me to end my pregnancy. And when I refused, you destroyed my life." Her voice shook with rage. "You don't have any rights. You're not Liam's father. You're just a sperm donor who ran." Ryan's face flickered, anger flashing in his eyes before he covered it quickly with fake pain. "You misunderstand. I'll explain everything. Give me a chance." He tried to step closer, and that was when Jack Sullivan appeared. The large bodyguard moved between them like a wall, blocking Ryan's view of Sloane entirely. "She told you to back off," Jack said, his voice low and dangerous. "I suggest you listen." Ryan looked at the bodyguard, and Sloane saw the moment he realized something. His eyes swept over Jack's black suit, the earpiece hooked to his ear, the professional stance of a trained man. You're with Whitaker?" Ryan asked, shock spilling into his voice. Sloane didn't answer. She didn't need to. Jack pushed her and Alara out of the store, gentle but firm. Mrs. Harlan, close behind, and within minutes they were in the car, speeding away through the crowd of shoppers before anyone fully understood what had happened. Ryan Mitchell stood there watching the car disappear, the regretful smile on his face dissolving as if it had never been real. He pulled out his phone, dialed a number already saved, and waited. "Talk," Russo's voice came through on the other end. "I got close," Ryan reported, his tone cold, stripped of emotion. "She really is with Whitaker. She's got security, at least one I saw, maybe more." "Good," Russo replied, satisfaction clear in his voice. "Keep going. Find a way to approach her again. Make her believe you truly want to come back, want to be the baby's father." "What about the bodyguard?" Ryan asked, frowning as he remembered Jack Sullivan's threatening stare. "Leave him to me," Russo said smoothly. "You only need one thing. Get her out of the penthouse. Lure her outside to a place where we can act. Can you do it?" Ryan was silent for a moment. Somewhere deep inside, a very small part of him understood what he was doing. He was pushing the woman who had once loved him, pushing his own child into the hands of a killer. But that part was too small, too weak, nowhere near strong enough to fight the ambition and selfishness that had rooted themselves into his bones his entire life. "I can," he said. And Sloane Hayes' fate was sealed by the very man she had once trusted most. That evening, when Sloane and Alara had just returned to the penthouse, Ronan was waiting at the elevator doors. One look at his face, and Sloane knew he already understood what had happened. Jack Sullivan stood beside him, his expression severe, and he began to report every second of the encounter in precise detail. Ryan Mitchell appeared. Ryan Mitchell approached Sloane. Ryan Mitchell demanded to see the child. Jack recounted it all with the exactness of a man trained to observe and remember, and with each sentence, Sloane watched Ronan change. Not with the loud anger she'd seen in other men. There was no shouting, no slamming fists, no breaking things. Instead, something far more terrifying settled over him. His face seemed to freeze, every line hardening into steel, but his gray eyes burned with a fire Sloane had never seen before. It was the look of a killer. When Jack finished, Ronan was silent for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and level in a way that made the hair rise on Sloane's arms. "Get out, all of you." No one needed to hear it twice. Jack Sullivan stepped into the elevator. Mrs. Harlan quickly led Alara toward the bedroom, and Sloane heard the little girl asking, "What's wrong with Daddy, Grandma?" before the door closed. In an instant, the vast living room held only three: Ronan, Sloane with Liam in her arms, and the fury boiling in the air. Ronan pulled out his phone, and Sloane realized he was calling someone. Her chest tightened when she heard the first word leave his mouth. "Mitchell!" Ronan's voice was cold enough to cut. "I know where you are. I know what you're doing. I know what game you're playing with Russo." Silence. Then Ryan's voice came through on speaker, loud enough for Sloane to hear. "You don't have the right to keep me from my child. That's my blood." Ronan laughed, and that laugh made Sloane shudder. There was no humor in it, only contempt and threat. "Your child," he repeated. "You call him your child. You abandoned him while he was still in his mother's womb. You disappeared like a coward when she needed you most. Your family tried to force her to end the pregnancy, and when she refused, you destroyed her life. You pushed her onto the streets, left her and the baby to nearly freeze to death in a winter night." His voice dropped, more dangerous than any shout. "Don't call him your child. You don't deserve to." "This is a family matter," Ryan said, trying to sound steady, though Sloane could hear the tremor underneath. "You're an outsider. You've got no right to interfere." "I'm an outsider," Ronan repeated, and Sloane saw his hand clamp around the phone until his knuckles went white. "Listen to me, Mitchell, and listen carefully, because I'm only going to say this once. If you come within 100 meters of her one more time, I'll show you what hell looks like. And when I say hell, I'm not speaking in metaphors. Ask Russo how many fingers his wife has received from traitors sent back in a gift box. Then decide whether you want to keep all 10. He ended the call without waiting for an answer, and the silence afterward was thick enough to choke on. Sloane stood near the wall, Liam asleep in her arms, unaware of anything, and she realized she was shaking, not from cold, but because for the first time she was truly seeing the monster inside the man she had begun to care about. Would you do what you said?" she managed, her voice trembling. "Would you really?" She couldn't finish the sentence. Ronan turned to her, and his gray eyes still burned with a fire that hadn't died down. "If it's necessary," he answered without hesitation. "If he threatens you, if he hurts you, if he lays one finger on you or Liam, I'll do everything I said and more." Silence stretched between them. Sloane felt her heart tearing itself apart between emotions that didn't belong together. Fear, gratitude, confusion, and something deeper she didn't dare name. "I'm afraid of you," she finally whispered, speaking the truth they both knew but neither had admitted. Ronan looked at her and something shifted in his eyes. The fire softened, giving way to a deep, ancient pain. He stepped toward her one step at a time, giving her time to back away if she wanted, but Sloane didn't move. She stayed still as he stopped, right in front of her, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off him. "I know," he said, his voice low and soft as breath. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, and the hand that had just threatened to cut off a man's fingers was gentle now, as if touching fragile glass. "But I won't let anyone hurt you, even if you're afraid of me, even if you hate me for what I am." "Even you?" Sloane asked, looking straight into his eyes. "Can you protect me from yourself?" Ronan was silent for a long time, so long Sloane thought he wouldn't answer. Then he did something she didn't expect. He pulled her into his arms, careful not to wake Liam, but tight enough that she could feel his heart beating hard against his chest. "I don't know," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking for the first time. "I truly don't know." A month passed like a dream Sloane didn't want to wake from. What she and Ronan had was growing in a way that felt natural, as if they had belonged to each other long before that winter night on the bus bench ever brought them together. There was no more hiding, no more stolen glances or accidental touches, followed by a hurried retreat. Sloane moved her things into Ronan's room, and each night she slept in his arms, feeling truly safe for the first time in years. Alara was the first to notice the change, and she didn't hide her delight at all. One morning at breakfast, she looked up at Ronan with sparkling eyes and asked in a clear, innocent voice, "Daddy, does Sloane sleep in your room all the time now, like husband and wife, like you and Mommy Vivian used to?" Ronan nearly choked on his coffee, and Sloane felt her cheeks flare hot. But before anyone could answer, Alara went on, hope bright in her tone. "I like it. I like Sloane. I want Sloane to stay with us forever." Mrs. Harlan stood beside the table, and for the first time in years, Sloane saw her truly smile. It was small, quick, but it was real, and it told Sloane the stern housekeeper had accepted her. After breakfast, when Alara ran off to play with Liam, Mrs. Harlan paused beside Sloane and spoke quietly, her voice warmer than Sloane had ever heard it. Vivian would be happy he found the light again. She didn't want him living in darkness forever. She didn't say anything else. She only stood there beside her, two strangers staring out at a sleeping city, each carrying their own wounds. They stood that way until the first streaks of dawn painted the Manhattan horizon pink. And through all that time, neither of them spoke another word. But Sloane felt it. For the first time in months of hell, she wasn't completely alone anymore. The following week, Ronan did something Sloane never expected. He made it public in the underworld that she was his, sending a clear message to every enemy that anyone who touched Sloane or her child would face his wrath. It protected her, but it also officially pulled her into his world with no way back. One evening, while the whole family was sitting in the living room, Ronan walked over to Liam's crib. He bent down, and for the first time since the baby had recovered, he lifted Liam into his arms. The baby looked at him with blue eyes like his mother's, then smiled, his tiny hand curling around Ronan's finger. Ronan studied Liam for a long time, then turned to Sloane. "If you'll let me," he said, his voice low and full of feeling. "I want to claim Liam as my son. Legally, he'll carry the Whitaker name. He'll be protected as my child. He'll have everything I can give." Sloane went still, tears spilling without permission. She wanted to speak, but her throat locked tight. Alara was the one who shattered the silence. She bounced in place, clapping and cheering. "So Liam is my little brother for real, for real. I want Liam to call me his big sister. I'm going to teach Liam to play dolls and draw and dance ballet." Sloane laughed through her tears, stepped to Ronan and wrapped her arms around both him and Liam. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I agree." In that moment, standing in Ronan's arms with Alara spinning and hopping around them and Liam laughing in his hands, Sloane felt as if she'd found the family she had never dared to dream of. 2 weeks after the day Ronan publicly declared he would claim Liam as his son, Sloane took her little boy in for a routine doctor appointment. It was the final checkup. The doctor said Liam was completely healthy, his lungs clear, with no sign left of the pneumonia from that winter night. Sloane felt a wave of relief as she stepped out of the exam room. Liam asleep in her arms after his vaccinations. Alara was at home with Mrs. Harlan and Sloane had promised to bring the little girl a chocolate cake from the bakery near the clinic. 2 bodyguards were with her, one driving, one in the front passenger seat. Both were Ronan's men, professionally trained and fully armed. Sloane was used to having someone with her whenever she went out, and she didn't resent it anymore. It was the price of loving a man like Ronan Whitaker. The car was traveling along a quiet road leading back toward Tribeca when everything happened too fast for Sloane to react. A large truck suddenly burst out of a side alley and swung across the road, blocking their path. The driver slammed on the brakes and Sloane was thrown forward, instinct making her clamp Liam tight to her chest to shield him. What the hell? The guard in the passenger seat didn't finish before gunshots cracked through the air. 2 shots, precise, lethal. Both bodyguards slumped instantly. Blood sprayed across the windshield and Sloane screamed in horror. The door on her side was yanked open and rough hands grabbed her, dragging her out. Sloane fought like a wild thing, kicking, clawing, biting, doing everything she could to keep Liam in her arms. "No, don't touch my baby. No," she screamed, her voice tearing through the cold air. A fist slammed into her face, hard enough to make her vision spark and spin, the taste of blood flooding her mouth. But she still didn't let go. She held Liam tighter, even as the world swayed. "Shut up!" a man's voice growled from behind a mask. "Take them both now." They ripped Liam from her arms, and her son's cry tore Sloane's heart apart. She tried to thrash, tried to reach for him, but someone bound her hands behind her back, blindfolded her with a strip of black cloth, and threw her into the back of the truck like a sack of trash. She heard Liam crying somewhere close, and she tried to crawl toward the sound, tried to tell him, "Mommy's here. Mommy will protect him." But the truck roared away, the engine swallowing every sound, and Sloane could only sob in the dark. In the Tribeca penthouse, Ronan was in a meeting with his men when his phone buzzed. He was about to ignore it, but something made him look at the screen. A video message from an unknown number. He opened it, and his world collapsed. On the screen, Sloane sat on a cold concrete floor, her hands tied behind her back, dried blood on her mouth and cheek. Her eyes were covered, but Ronan could still see fear in the way her shoulders shook. And in the corner of the frame, Liam lay in a rusted metal crib, crying until his throat was raw. Russo's voice came through the video, cold and pleased. "Whitaker, long time no see. I've got a gift for you." A mocking chuckle. "Trade her life and the boys for your empire. All of it. Everything you've built. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let them live. You've got hours." The video ended. Ronan stood frozen for a second, then another. Then he hurled the phone into the wall with all his strength. The screen shattered, but it didn't cool the fury boiling inside him. He overturned the meeting table, papers flying everywhere, and a roar ripped out of his throat like the sound of a wounded animal. Dante Reeves burst into the room, his face draining as he took in the scene. "What happened?" "Russo," Ronan ground out, each word forged from ice and fire. "He's got Sloane. He's got Liam." Dante went still, then understood at once. It isn't just territory. He wants revenge. Revenge for his brother. Ronan stared into empty air, and Dante saw something in his boss's eyes he had never seen before. Fear. Years earlier, after Vivian was assassinated, Ronan had found Russo's brother, the man who had directly orchestrated the attack. He had killed him in a way the New York underworld still shuddered to mention. It had been revenge, justice, the way their world understood it. But Russo hadn't forgotten. He had waited until Ronan had something to lose. "He wants me to hurt the way he hurt," Ronan whispered, his voice breaking. "He wants me to watch the people I love die the way I made him watch his brother die. And he knows exactly how to do it." Dante put a hand on his shoulder. "We'll find her. We'll bring her back." Ronan lifted his head, and his gray eyes now burned with the fire of hell. "Hours," he said. "He gave me hours. He won't live to see our next sunrise." That night, the penthouse became a war headquarters. Ronan summoned his entire force, and within minutes, dozens of men in black suits poured in, lining up in the vast living room like ghosts, waiting for orders. They were the most loyal men of the Whitaker Empire, men who had lived and died by Ronan's command for years, weapons ready, faces frozen. No one asked why. No one needed details. They only needed to know the boss had called. And they came. Dante Reeves stood over a map spread across the table and pointed to a spot in Brooklyn. "We've confirmed the location," he said, his voice firm. "An abandoned warehouse in the old industrial district near the docks. Russo is holding her there." Ronan stared at the map, gray eyes scanning every street, every entrance, every place an ambush could be waiting. "How many of Russo's men?" "At least 30, Dante answered. "He's prepared. He's probably been waiting for this chance for a long time." "Then we need 50, Ronan said without hesitation. "Call in more from New Jersey. I want that warehouse surrounded before he even realizes we're there." Dante nodded and turned to bark orders to the men under him. The room surged with phone calls, radio chatter, hurried footsteps. But in the middle of that storm of activity, Dante paused beside Ronan and rested a hand on his shoulder, the way a father might rest a hand on a son. "Russo wants you to come alone," Dante said, dropping his voice so only the two of them could hear. "This is a trap, Ronan. You know that." "I know," Ronan said, not turning. "Vivian wouldn't want you to die with her," Dante went on, his tone heavy. "She wanted you to live. She wanted you to take care of Ilara." Ronan turned and Dante saw those gray eyes rimmed red, not with rage, but with pain, held back by sheer will. "Vivian would want me to save the people I love, Dante," Ronan said, his voice cracking. "That's what she would do. That's what she did for me. She died for me. And I won't let it happen again. I won't stand there and watch another woman die in my arms." Dante stayed quiet for a long time, looking at the man he had served for years. From the days when Ronan was an ambitious kid to the day he became the most powerful boss in New York. Dante had watched Ronan love, lose, suffer, and freeze, and now he was watching Ronan come back to life. "She'd be proud of you, Ronan," Dante said at last, his voice unusually warm. "Vivian would be proud to see you open your heart again. She'd be glad you found someone new, that Ilara has a mother, that you aren't living in the dark anymore." Ronan didn't answer with words, but he reached out, took Dante's hand, and squeezed. It was the first time in years he'd done that, and Dante understood. It was gratitude, trust, a goodbye in case the worst happened. Then Ronan let go, turned away, and walked down the hallway toward Ilara's room. The pink princess bedroom was peaceful in the night, a star-shaped nightlight throwing small streaks of light across the ceiling. Ilara was asleep, chestnut curls spilled across her pillow. One arm wrapped around a teddy bear, her angel face unaware that outside this room, the world was falling apart. Ronan sat down beside his daughter's bed and watched her sleep. Years ago, Vivian had given birth to this little girl, and Ronan had thought that was the happiest day of his life. Then years ago, he lost Vivian, and Ilara became the only reason he kept breathing. Now there was Sloane too, Liam too, a family he never expected to have. He bent down, kissed Ilara's forehead, and whispered into her ear, even though he knew she couldn't hear him. "I'm going to bring Mommy Sloane back, sweetheart. I promise. I'm going to bring Mommy and baby Liam home safe." It was the first time he had called Sloane Ilara's mother, and as he said the words, Ronan realized how true they were. Sloane had become Ilara's mother in every way that mattered, and he would not let anyone steal that away. When he stood, he saw Mrs. Harlan in the doorway. The stern housekeeper he had known for years was crying, tears slipping silently down her lined cheeks. "Bring her home, Mr. Whitaker," she said, her voice trembling. "Bring them both home. This house needs them. Ilara needs them." She paused, then added, her voice breaking, "You need them." Ronan stepped to her and set a hand on her shoulder like a vow. "I'll bring them home," he said, "or I'll die trying." The abandoned warehouse sat in an old industrial district in Brooklyn, far from Manhattan's crowded streets, as if it belonged to a different world. Inside, sickly yellow light from bare bulbs hanging on loose wires spilled across a vast space, reeking of damp and machine oil. Cracked concrete pillars held up a rusted metal roof, and the night wind slid through the gaps, shaping a thin, piercing whistle that sounded like the moaning of forgotten souls. Sloane sat on a wooden chair in the middle of the warehouse, her hands bound tight behind her back with coarse rope that bit into her skin every time she tried to struggle. Blood had dried on her mouth and cheek from the punch earlier that afternoon, and her body ached from cold and exhaustion. But what hurt most wasn't the bruises on her skin. It was Liam's weak crying from the rusted iron crib a few meters away. Her son had cried until his voice went raw, and now there were only small, broken sobs, as if even the baby had begun to give up hope. Victor Russo sat on a chair across from Sloane, one leg propped on a wooden crate, a half-burned Cuban cigar between his fingers. He was a man in his 40s, with an angular face marked by a long scar running from his temple down to his cheekbone, and black eyes cold as a snake's. He watched Sloane with the pleased patience of a cat playing with a mouse before the kill. Russo spoke, blowing cigar smoke into the air, and said that Whitaker killed his brother right in front of him, that Whitaker forced him to watch every second and every minute while his brother begged to live. He tilted his head, a chilly smile spreading across his mouth, and swore on his brother's grave that he would take from Whitaker what Whitaker valued most. And now fate had delivered Sloane to him. Sloane said nothing. She only stared back with hatred. She wasn't afraid anymore. Or maybe she had been afraid so long she could no longer feel it. All she could think about was Liam and Alara waiting at home. And Ronan. The warehouse door creaked open, and Sloane turned her head. When she saw who walked in, it felt like a fist had slammed into her stomach. Ryan Mitchell. He wore the familiar gray suit, but his usual confidence was gone, replaced by strain and worry carved into every line of his face. He avoided her eyes, staring at the floor, the wall, anywhere but her. "Sloane," she whispered, her voice breaking with shock, asking him if he was here, asking what he was doing here. Ryan still didn't look at her and said he had no choice. Russo laughed, the sound echoing through the warehouse like a crow's call, and asked if she still didn't know. He stood, stepped to Ryan, and patted his shoulder the way a man pats an ally. He told Sloane that her sweet former boyfriend was the one who tipped him off, that Ryan told him where she was, what she was doing, who she was with, that Ryan helped him plan her kidnapping. Russo looked at Ryan with contempt and said it was all just to silence one mouth. The world seemed to spin around Sloane. She looked at Ryan, the man she had once loved, once trusted, once carried a child for, and she saw the truth written plainly across his face. He didn't deny it. He didn't explain. He only stood there in silence, the coward he had always been. Sloane said his name, trembling, trying to form the rest. But Ryan finally exploded, turning on her with eyes full of resentment, shouting that she would destroy his career, that the illegitimate child scandal, the single mother, all of it would be exposed if she stayed alive, that he was about to become a senator, that she had to understand that he couldn't let her ruin everything. Sloane asked if that meant he wanted to kill her, and a bitter laugh slipped from her lips and mingled with the tears running down her face. She asked if he wanted to kill his own son, his blood. Ryan went silent. He didn't deny it. He didn't justify it. He only stayed silent, and that silence was a clearer answer than any words. Russo cut it off, glanced down at his watch, and said Whitaker was about to arrive, and everyone should take their positions. Masked men moved through the shadows, weapons ready, and Sloane realized they were preparing for a war. Then the main door of the warehouse opened, and Ronan Whitaker walked in. He came in alone, unarmed, his black coat shifting in the cold wind pouring through the doorway. His gray eyes swept the warehouse, swept over Russo, over Ryan, over the armed men. But they didn't stop. They stopped only when they found Sloane. He asked if she was all right, his voice low and filled with worry, as if there weren't dozens of guns aimed at him. Sloane cried, tears spilling out beyond her control, and she could only say his name. Russo stood, stepped to Sloane, and drew his gun, pressing it straight to her head. Cold metal touched her temple, and Sloane closed her eyes, feeling death's breath right beside her. Russo spoke with pleasure, calling Whitaker by name and saying he was on time as always, that he liked that about him. He pressed the barrel harder into Sloane's head and said the tenderness was enough. Now they would talk business. Whitaker's empire, the signature to transfer it, everything Whitaker owned, and maybe, just maybe, he would let her live. Ronan looked at Russo, then at Sloane, then at Liam lying in the iron crib, and when he spoke, his calm was terrifying. He said, "Yes." Ronan slowly slid his hand into the inside pocket of his coat, and Russo immediately snarled, the gun barrel pressing harder into Sloane's temple. "Easy, one wrong move and she dies." Ronan stopped, his gray eyes locking onto Russo's. "I'm just getting a pen to sign the papers," he said, his voice strangely calm. "You want my empire, don't you? I'll give it to you." He drew his hand out with agonizing slowness, and in his hand was not a pen. It was a small radio. Before Russo could react, Ronan pressed the button and spoke a single word. "Dante, now!" Hell broke loose. The high windows exploded. Gunfire erupted from every direction like rolling thunder, and Whitaker's men flooded into the warehouse like a black tide. They rappelled down from the roof, smashed through doors from the emergency exits, and cut down Russo's men before they could even understand what was happening. In the first instant of chaos, Russo was distracted. The gun lifting away from Sloane's head for a fraction of a second, but a fraction of a second was all Ronan needed. He lunged toward Sloane like an arrow, his body shielding her from the storm of bullets ripping through the air. A round tore across his shoulder, shredding fabric and leaving a streak of red, but he didn't slow. He drew a small knife hidden in his sleeve, cut through Sloane's ropes in a few clean strokes, then shoved a compact handgun into her palm, one he had hidden at his ankle. "Protect Liam," he said, his voice hard. "Don't leave this corner. Shoot anyone who comes near except my men." Sloane trembled, but she nodded, sprinted to the rusted crib, yanked the latch, and pulled Liam tight against her chest. She ducked behind a concrete pillar, the gun raised in front of her. And even though she had never fired a gun in her life, she knew she would do anything to protect her child. The warehouse became a battlefield. Bullets crossed the air, shots cracking like whips, screams, the groans of the wounded. Russo's men were many, but they were caught off guard. While Whitaker's force was prepared and struck with lethal precision, one by one, Russo's soldiers fell. In the chaos, Ryan Mitchell tried to run. He slipped between crates, searching for an exit, his face chalk white with terror. He wasn't a fighter. He wasn't built for the underworld. He was only a coward who had wandered into a game far too big for him. But Russo saw him. "Where do you think you're going, you coward?" He roared, and a gunshot rang out. Ryan pitched forward onto the floor, the bullet burying itself in his back. Blood spread beneath him, and he tried to turn his head, looking toward Sloane. His lips moved as if he wanted to say something. Maybe an apology, maybe an explanation, maybe only a plea, but no sound came. The light in his eyes went out, and Ryan Mitchell died on the warehouse floor, mourned by no one. "I hate traitors." Russo spat onto Ryan's body, then turned back to the fight. Sloane watched the father of her child die, and she was startled to realize she felt nothing. No pain, no grief, no hatred, only emptiness. As if Ryan Mitchell had died inside her long before the bullet ended him. The gunfire began to thin as Russo's men were nearly wiped out. In the end, only 2 men remained standing, facing each other amid the wreckage, Ronan Whitaker and Victor Russo. Both were covered in blood. Both were exhausted. Both were out of ammunition. Russo pulled a knife from his belt, the steel blade gleaming under the sick yellow light. "Finish it like men, Whitaker," he said, a mad smile twisting his mouth. "You and me. No guns, no backup, just you and me." Ronan didn't answer. He raised the knife he'd used to cut Sloane free, and the 2 men slammed into each other. The hand-to-hand fight was brutal and primitive. Knife met knife, blood sprayed, snarls, and ragged breathing. Russo was a seasoned fighter, but Ronan fought with the desperation of a man protecting everything he loved. Seize Russo's wrist, wrench it hard, and seize Russo's wrist, wrench it hard, and slam his enemy to the floor. He straddled Russo, choking him with one hand, and with the other, he tore the knife from his own side with a roar of pain. Ronan looked down at the man who had taken Vivian, who had nearly taken Sloane and Liam. "You killed Vivian," he said, his voice like ice. Russo laughed, blood spilling from his mouth. "And you'll live with that pain forever, Whitaker. Even if I die, you'll see her face every night. You'll never have peace." "No," Ronan said. "Not anymore." He drove the knife down straight through Russo's chest. That's for Vivian. He yanked the blade free, blood splashing his hand, and stabbed again. And that's for Sloane. Russo jerked a few times, black eyes wide and fixed on the warehouse ceiling, then went still. Years of blood debt. Finally paid. Ronan staggered to his feet, blood streaming from the wound in his side. He moved toward Sloane one step at a time, heavy as if the whole world sat on his shoulders. He managed only to see her face, to see Liam safe in her arms, and then he collapsed right in front of them. "Ronan!" Sloane screamed, setting Liam down and throwing herself beside him. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands shaking as she tried to press down on the wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. "I'm here. Don't leave me. Please don't leave me." Ronan looked up at her and a weak smile touched his lips. I promised I'd bring you home." Then his eyes closed. Ronan survived the surgery. The doctors called it a miracle, saying the stab wound had missed his heart by only a few centimeters, saying the amount of blood he lost would have killed anyone else. But Ronan Whitaker wasn't anyone else, and he fought to live with the same ferocity he used to protect the people he loved. Sloane didn't leave the hospital for the first weeks. She slept in the chair beside his bed, held his hand every night as if she feared that the moment she let go, he would disappear. Mrs. Harlan cared for Alara and Liam back at the penthouse, and Dante Reeves made sure no one could threaten the Whitaker family while the boss was weak. Months of recovery passed slowly but steadily. Ronan went from being unable to sit up to being able to walk to training to regain his strength. Sloane stayed beside him every step of the way, steadying him when he staggered, laughing when he snapped in frustration at his own helplessness, kissing him every night before sleep, and telling him she loved him, that she was grateful to him, that she wasn't going anywhere. The Whitaker empire stood stronger than ever after Russo was eliminated. No enemy dared challenge him anymore, and New York finally settled into peace under Ronan's rule. But what mattered more to him than power or territory was the Tribeca penthouse, now overflowing with laughter. Sloane opened a small interior design studio in the heart of Manhattan, turning an old dream into something real. She worked part-time, spending most of her time with her family. But every time she finished a project, her eyes lit with a pride Ronan loved more than he could say. Alara and Liam became inseparable. The child took her role as big sister with an earnestness that was almost too sweet, teaching Liam everything from how to clap to how to say mama and dada. Liam, now months old, looked at Alara as if she were his whole world, and the sound of the two children laughing each day was the most beautiful music the penthouse had ever known. Mrs. Harlan became a grandmother in the children's eyes, even though she never officially accepted the title. She was still strict, still ran the house with an iron hand. But whenever Alara called out, "Mrs. Harlan," or Liam reached toward her, her gaze softened in a way only the people who truly loved her would ever notice. One winter night, as snow began to fall and turn the city white, Ronan said to Sloane, "I want to take you somewhere tonight." Sloane didn't ask where. She trusted him, and she had learned that sometimes the most beautiful surprises came from letting Ronan lead. The black Maybach slid through Manhattan streets, and when it stopped, Sloane looked out the window and felt her heart seize. The old bus stop in the Lower East Side, the rusted bench was still there, dusted with a thin layer of white snow. The bus sign still blinking in the winter night, the place where everything began. "Why here?" she whispered, her eyes filling. Ronan didn't answer. He only took her hand and led her out of the car. They walked through the fresh snow to the bench, and Ronan stopped. Then he dropped to one knee, right where he had knelt almost a year earlier to cover a freezing baby in the arms of a desperate mother. "Months ago," he began, his voice low and trembling slightly with feeling. "I almost died. When I was on that operating table, when I was on the line between life and death, I only thought one thing." He looked up at her, gray eyes shining under the streetlight. "I thought I hadn't asked you yet." He pulled a red velvet box from his coat and opened it to reveal a ring. Not a huge, glittering diamond the way people might expect a mafia boss to give, but a classic, elegant ring with a small, refined diamond set among curves of white gold shaped like petals. "This was my mother's ring," Ronan said. "She gave it to me before she died and told me it was for the woman who makes her son want to live, not just exist." He took a deep breath. "Sloane Hayes, you came to me when I didn't believe in anything anymore. You gave me back faith in life, in love, in family. You gave me everything." His voice broke. "Will you give me your whole life, too?" Sloane cried, tears streaming down her cheeks, but these were tears of joy. She knelt to his level, cupped his face in both hands, and spoke with all the love she had. "Since that night, since the night you knelt by this bench and wrapped my son in your scarf, since the moment you gave us a chance to live," she smiled through her tears, "my answer has always been yes, Ronan. Always, always." Ronan slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms and kissed her in the falling snow in the very place where almost a year earlier, fate had woven two strangers together. 1 year later, in the snow-white garden of the Connecticut estate, a private wedding took place beneath gentle winter sunlight. There were no hundreds of guests, no press, no display of an empire, only family and the closest loved ones, gathered under an arch of white flowers, witnessing two souls that had once been broken find each other in the cold of a winter night. Alara served as the flower girl, her white dress billowing like a true little princess, a basket of white roses in her hands as she scattered the petals one by one along the aisle with an adorable seriousness. Liam, now months old and walking in unsteady little steps, was guided beside her by Dante Reeves, his tiny legs wobbling over grass dusted with snow, while he giggled in pure delight. Mrs. Harlan sat in the front row, crying through the entire ceremony, with a smile that never left her mouth, dabbing at her eyes again and again without trying to hide it. When Sloane appeared, the whole garden seemed to stop breathing. She wore a simple wedding gown, no long trailing train, no heavy embellishment, only pure white silk that held her like a gentle embrace. In her hands was a small bouquet of white flowers, and her blue eyes looked at only one person, the man waiting at the end of the aisle. Ronan Whitaker, the most powerful boss in New York, the man the entire city feared, stood there with tears sliding down his cheeks. For the first time in his life, he didn't hide. He didn't have to be strong, didn't have to be cold, didn't have to be anyone other than a man who was loving and being loved. They slipped rings onto each other's fingers, simple vows spoken with honesty in the cold air. And when they kissed, Alara clapped and cheered. Liam copied his sister and clapped too, even though he didn't understand what was happening. And the children's laughter blended with the adults' applause, creating the most beautiful music this garden had ever heard. After the ceremony, the whole family went outside to play in the snow. Alara eagerly tried to teach Liam how to build a snowman, though he only knew how to scoop up handfuls of snow and toss them everywhere, sometimes hitting his sister in the face and making them both laugh until they couldn't breathe. Ronan stood beside Sloane with his arm around her shoulders, watching the two children play under the afternoon sun. "Do you ever regret it?" Sloane asked, resting her head against his shoulder. "Stopping that night." Ronan was silent for a moment. Then he turned to her. "That night I didn't stop, Sloane. Alara stopped me. She looked at me with Vivian's eyes and asked why someone was sleeping out in the cold. She saved all of us." Sloane smiled, watching Alara try to balance a snowball on the snowman's head. "She's got a gift. She's like her mother," Ronan said softly. And now he kissed Sloane's forehead. "She's like you too, Mom and Dad." Alara ran over, grabbing both their hands and tugging hard. "Make snow angels with me and Liam, too." So the whole family lay down in the snow, 4 of them side by side, arms sweeping up and down to draw angel wings. 4 snow angels lay beside each other, different sizes, but their wings touched as if they had belonged together from the beginning. Sometimes the most beautiful beginnings come from the darkest nights. Sometimes even a monster has a heart. And sometimes all it takes is a child asking why she's sleeping outside for everything to change. Love doesn't choose where it blooms. It can begin on a freezing bench, in the arms of darkness, and in the middle of an empire of crime. And sometimes the mercy of the devil is the most beautiful miracle of all. This story teaches us that it's never too late to begin again, that light can be found in the darkest places, and that love has the power to heal every wound if we're brave enough to open our hearts. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with anyone who needs to believe in second chances. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel so you won't miss moving stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Did it remind you of anything in real life? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We truly want to hear what's deep in your heart. Wishing everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days ahead. Thank you for staying with us until the end of the story. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.